The entire town of Black Mountain laughed every time they saw Mason Reed step into the scrap wood pile behind the sawmill. To them, he was no longer a former Navy SEAL who had survived war. He was just a man in a faded old jacket, silently digging through burned boards, broken pallets, and cracked pieces of wood like someone who had lost his mind after the day he lost his wife and little girl. Mason heard every word. He only bent down, picked up another piece of wood, and walked away. But that afternoon, Rook, the German shepherd he had once rescued from that very junkyard, suddenly ran out of the rain with a blackened piece of wood clenched in his mouth. Mason glanced at it and threw it onto the discard pile. Rook brought it back. He threw it away again. The dog came back again, placed the piece of wood at his feet, and let out a low growl toward the darkness beyond the trees. That night, Mason pressed his chisel into the burned grain. Then he heard a small click. It was not wood. Hidden inside the piece of trash the whole town had refused to look at was a secret buried deep within. And before midnight, a black SUV stopped outside Mason's barn. They thought they had come to recover a scrap of wood, but Rook had dug up a secret someone was willing to kill to keep buried forever. Every heart carries wounds, and you are here at Healing Hearts. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell for more stories like this. Leave a comment and tell us how old you are and where you are watching from. And now, let's begin. Rain drifted over Black Mountain, North Carolina, in thin silver lines, soft enough not to be called a storm, but cold enough to make the whole town pull its collars high. The Blue Ridge Mountains stood behind the roofs like sleeping giants, their ridges half hidden in fog. Main Street smelled of wet leaves, old brick, chimney smoke, and coffee from the diner near the railroad crossing. At the far edge of town, behind Kavanaugh Sawmill, the air smelled different. It smelled of sap, diesel, mud, and sawdust. Lumber trucks came and went before sunrise, carrying straight boards and clean beams to places where houses would be built and families would move in. But behind the mill, past the gravel lot and the chain-link fence, sat the things no one wanted. Broken pallets, cracked boards, burned strips of pine, warped oak pieces split down the middle, short chunks of maple too ugly for furniture and too small for construction. Most people called it trash. Mason Reed never did. Mason was 39 years old, a former Navy SEAL with a lean, rugged build and shoulders that still carried the shape of a man trained to endure. He stood 6 feet tall, though grief had bent something inside him that posture could not hide. His dark brown hair was cut short, gray beginning to show at the temples. A trimmed stubble beard covered a weathered face marked by sun, sleepless nights, and a silence that made strangers step carefully around him. His eyes were blue-gray, cold at first glance but not cruel. They were the eyes of a man who had learned to notice everything and trust almost nothing. Once those eyes had watched hostile roads, dark water, and doors that might open into gunfire. Once men had followed him into places where fear had teeth. Then life took from him what war never could. His wife, Emily Reed, had been 36 when she died. She had soft brown hair, patient hands, and a voice that could calm a crying child before the first tear finished falling. Emily had taught kindergarten at Black Mountain Elementary, where everyone knew her as the woman who kept extra mittens in her desk and remembered every child's favorite color. She had loved Mason without trying to pry open the locked rooms inside him. Their daughter, Clara, had been 8, small, bright-eyed, and stubborn in the way happy children can afford to be. She liked blueberry pancakes, horses, and chess, though she gave the pieces names and made them talk to each other until Mason laughed so hard, Emily had to tell them both to quiet down. Clara's favorite piece was the rook, because it guarded the corners. 3 winters earlier, on a slick mountain road, a delivery truck lost control on black ice. Mason came home from the hospital alone. After the funeral, people waited for him to recover in a way they understood. They expected him to go back to work, attend church, shake hands, accept casseroles, maybe speak about healing at the Veterans Hall someday. Instead, Mason sold the newer house Emily had loved and moved into his grandfather's old farmhouse outside town. The house sat beyond a narrow road lined with pines. White paint peeled from the porch rails. The roof needed work. Behind it stood an old red barn, leaning slightly to one side, its boards faded by decades of mountain weather. Inside the barn, Mason kept the things he could not throw away. Clara's purple bicycle with streamers still hanging from the handlebars, Emily's gardening gloves, a cardboard box of family photographs, and a small chessboard missing one rook. He also kept wood. Every Tuesday afternoon, after the sawmill dumped another load of scraps, Mason drove his old pickup behind the yard and climbed into the pile. That was when the laughing started. At first, it came from the mill workers, then from men in passing trucks, then from people who had no reason to be there except that small towns have a way of gathering around someone else's pain and calling it concern. "There he goes again," someone muttered one wet afternoon. "Used to be a Navy SEAL," another voice said. "Now look at him. Man's digging through garbage like it's buried treasure." Mason heard them. A SEAL learned to hear everything. A safety clicking off, gravel shifting under a boot, a breath held too long behind a wall. So he heard the jokes. He heard the pity. He heard the word crazy spoken softly, as if softness made it kinder. He did not answer. He bent down, pulled a cracked strip of walnut from the mud, wiped it once with his thumb, and carried it to his truck. Among the people who watched him most often was Dottie Lane, the owner of Lane's Market on Main Street. Dottie was 62, short and round-faced, with carefully curled gray hair and bright floral sweaters that made her look warmer than her words. Years earlier, after Mason lost Emily and Clara, she had left chicken soup on his porch every Thursday. When he stopped opening the door, her tenderness hardened into judgment. She still said she worried about him, but worry in Dottie's mouth usually sounded like accusation. "That man needs help," she said from beneath her umbrella. "No normal person spends his afternoons picking through scrap." Beside the loading dock stood Earl Whitcomb, one of the sawmill drivers. Earl was 58, tall and narrow, with a silver mustache, a grease-stained cap, and hands permanently darkened by oil and bark dust. Earl did not laugh as much as the others. He remembered Mason as a boy who once built a birdhouse from fence scraps for his mother's birthday. Still, even Earl could not understand why a grown man would haul home wood that the mill had already rejected. "You know, half that stuff won't hold together," Earl called. Mason lifted a burned board from the pile. One end was blackened. The other showed a pale line of grain beneath the soot. "Maybe not," Mason said. "That all you got to say?" Mason placed the board in the truck bed. It was already thrown away. Earl watched him for a long moment, then looked down at his boots. He did not know why those words made him feel ashamed. Back at the farmhouse, Mason carried the wood into the barn. Rain ticked against the tin roof. A single yellow bulb hung from the rafters, throwing a circle of light over an old workbench scarred by years of blades, hammers, and weather. The shelves along the wall were filled with things Mason had carved from scraps. A small bird made from ash wood, one wing lifted as if it had just remembered the sky. A horse no bigger than his palm, its mane rough but full of motion. A wooden rose, uneven and tender, carved from a piece of pine most people would have used to start a fire. Two chairs side by side, empty and facing a window. Mason did not call them art. He called them finished only when they stopped hurting his hands. At night, when the farmhouse became too quiet, he carved. When he woke from dreams with Emily's name trapped in his throat, he carved. When he remembered Clara asking if heroes ever got scared, he carved until the question dulled enough to survive. The town thought he was collecting junk. They did not know he was trying to keep from disappearing. That evening, the rain grew colder. Fog moved low between the trees, sliding across the field behind the barn like something searching for a place to rest. Mason had unloaded the last pieces from his truck and stacked them beside the fence. He was about to close the barn door when a sound slipped through the rain. It was faint. So faint that another man might have missed it. Mason stopped moving. The sound came again. A thin, trembling whimper. His hand tightened around the barn door. For a moment the world narrowed to rain, darkness, and that fragile sound rising from the scrap pile beside the fence. Mason reached for the flashlight on the workbench and stepped back into the cold. The beam cut across wet grass, muddy tire tracks, broken boards, and the jagged shapes of two collapsed pallets. Water ran down the back of his neck. The wind moved through the pines with a low, mournful breath. Then something shifted beneath the wood. Mason lowered the flashlight. Under the broken pallets, in the same pile the whole town had called trash, something small whimpered again. And for the first time in 3 years, the man who had survived war felt his hand shake. Mason Reed stood in the rain, with the flashlight trembling in his hand. For a long second, he did not move. The sound beneath the broken pallets was so small that it hardly seemed possible it belonged to anything still alive. Rain tapped against the warped plywood. Water ran through the cracks in the wood and gathered in dark puddles around Mason's boots. Somewhere beyond the fence, the sawmill's nightlights buzzed in the mist, turning the scrapyard into a field of shadows and wet splinters. Then the whimper came again. Mason knelt. He set the flashlight on a half-buried board, angled the beam under the collapsed pallets, and reached for the top piece of wood. The first pallet was heavier than it looked, soaked through and slick with mud. He lifted it slowly, careful not to let the broken slats shift downward. Beneath it was another sheet of plywood, cracked through the middle and pinned by a tangle of rusted wire. The small sound stopped. "It's all right," Mason whispered, though his voice sounded strange to him. He had spoken to men under fire, to wounded soldiers waiting for evacuation, to grieving fathers at funerals. But he had not used that soft tone in years. Not since Clara had woken from nightmares and called for him from the hallway. He pulled his work gloves tighter and bent the wire away. Something beneath the pallet moved. Mason lifted the plywood just enough for the flashlight beam to slip underneath, and there, pressed into the mud between two broken boards, was a puppy. A German shepherd. Male, maybe 3 months old, though starvation made him look smaller. His black and tan fur was soaked flat against his ribs. Mud clung to his belly and ears. One front leg was trapped under a coil of thin wire that had cut into the skin above his paw. His body shook so hard, the wet boards around him seemed to tremble with him. He tried to pull back when Mason reached in, but he had no strength left. His mouth opened as if to bark, but only a breath came out. His eyes stopped Mason cold. They were dark, frightened, and exhausted. But somewhere inside them, under all that fear, there was still a spark that had not gone out. The puppy looked at Mason like he expected pain, yet his tail moved once against the mud. Just once. A small, foolish, heartbreaking attempt at hope. Mason swallowed hard. "Well," he said quietly, You picked a bad place to wait out the rain. The puppy blinked. Mason worked slowly. He freed the wire from the little leg first, using a pair of cutters from his belt. The puppy flinched when the metal loosened, but did not bite. That almost hurt Mason more. A healthy puppy should have fought him. This one had already learned that fighting did not always help. By the time Mason lifted him from under the pallets, the animal felt almost weightless in his arms. Too light for a German Shepherd. Too cold for anything that was supposed to keep living. Mason tucked the puppy inside his jacket, pressing the small body against his chest. The puppy gave one weak shiver, then pushed his nose under Mason's chin. Mason froze again. Not because the dog had hurt him, because the last living thing that had rested that trustingly against him had been Clara, asleep in the passenger seat after a long day at the county fair, her sticky hand holding half a paper bag of kettle corn. "Don't do that," Mason whispered. But he did not put the puppy down. He carried him across the yard, through the rain, and into the barn. The old yellow bulb swung slightly in the wind from the open door. The barn looked warmer than it was, filled with wood shavings, tools, and the quiet shapes of half-finished carvings. Mason cleared space on the workbench, then stopped. The bench was too hard, too cold. He turned instead to an old cedar chest near the back wall. Inside were things he rarely touched. A child's pink raincoat, a stack of drawings, a folded quilt Emily had used on winter evenings, and beneath them, wrapped carefully in tissue, Clara's small blue blanket with faded white stars stitched along the edges. Mason stood over it for a long moment. Then he took it out. The puppy was shivering worse now, his wounded paw tucked against his body. Mason wrapped him in the blanket and rubbed gently until the thin body warmed a little under his hands. The puppy made a broken sound, half whimper, half sigh, and closed his eyes. "No," Mason said, more sharply than he meant to. "You stay awake." The puppy opened one eye. "That's right." Mason grabbed his truck keys. Dr. Helen Morris's clinic stood on the south side of Black Mountain, beside a laundromat and a closed antique store with dusty quilts in the window. The sign out front read, "Morris Animal Clinic" in faded blue letters. Helen Morris was 67, tall and narrow, with silver hair always tied in a low bun and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She had the calm hands of someone who had delivered calves in snowstorms, stitched hunting dogs after bear encounters, and comforted children holding shoeboxes with no happy ending inside. She had known Emily. She had treated the classroom rabbit Emily once kept at the school, and she had sent flowers after the funeral without writing anything more than, "I am sorry." When Mason pushed through the clinic door close to closing time, Helen looked up from the front desk and went still. "Mason?" He held out the bundle. "I found him under pallets behind Kavanaugh." Helen moved quickly then, not dramatically, not with panic, but with the quiet urgency of someone who knew when minutes mattered. She led him into an exam room, spread a clean towel over the metal table, and unwrapped the puppy with care. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured. The puppy tried to lift his head at her voice. His ears were too large for his face, one standing halfway up and the other folded sideways from the rain. Up close, he was beautiful in the rough, unfinished way young shepherds often were. Oversized paws, black mask, tan cheeks, and a narrow white scrape along his muzzle. He smelled of wet fur, mud, old smoke, and fear. Helen checked his gums, his eyes, his heartbeat. She clipped away the fur around the wire wound and cleaned the cut, while the puppy trembled but stayed quiet. Mason stood near the wall with his arms folded, watching every movement. "He's dehydrated," Helen said, "undernourished." The leg is infected, but I don't think the tendon is damaged. No collar, no chip that I can feel, but I'll scan him to be sure. She passed the scanner over the puppy's shoulders. It made no sound. Helen's mouth tightened. Someone dumped him. Mason looked at the puppy. Maybe he wandered. Mason. Helen's voice softened, but her eyes did not. A 3-month-old shepherd doesn't end up tied in wire under a pallet pile by accident. The room went quiet, except for the hum of the fluorescent light. Helen wrapped the leg, gave the puppy fluids, and placed a small bowl of softened food near his nose. At first, he only sniffed. Then hunger overpowered fear. He ate slowly, then faster, then stopped as if afraid someone would take it from him. Mason looked away. He would not have made it through another night out there, Helen said. Mason nodded once. I can call Asheville Rescue in the morning, she added. They have foster homes. Good ones. That's probably best. The words came out too quickly. Helen studied him. She had the kind of face that did not need to accuse a person to make him confess to himself. Probably. Mason looked down at his hands. There was mud under his nails and a thin smear of blood on his jacket sleeve from the puppy's leg. I'm not looking for a dog. I know. I don't need something depending on me. No one ever does until it happens. Mason gave her a tired look. That's supposed to be medical advice? For you, it might be. The puppy, full now and wrapped again in Clara's blanket, shifted on the towel. He stretched his neck forward, clumsy and weak, and pressed his nose against Mason's hand. Mason did not move. The puppy gave a tiny sigh and rested there. Helen saw it. Mason knew she saw it, and he hated her a little for being kind enough not to smile. I'll send antibiotics home, she said, and instructions. He'll need warmth, food in small amounts, and that leg kept clean. If you decide not to keep him, bring him back tomorrow and I'll make the call. Mason looked at the puppy's half-folded ear, the wounded paw, the absurd trust in his tired little face. Tomorrow, he thought. He could decide tomorrow. But when he carried the puppy back through the rain and into the barn, something had already shifted. The place did not feel less haunted. The bicycle was still there. The photographs were still unopened. The 2 empty chairs still faced the window. But now there was a small creature breathing inside Clara's blanket. Mason made a bed from old towels near the workbench. The puppy circled once, stumbled, and collapsed with his chin on his paws. His eyes followed Mason as the man moved around the barn, shutting the door, banking the small heater, stacking the new scraps he had brought from the sawmill. On the shelf above the workbench sat Clara's old chessboard. Mason had not touched it in months. 1 rook was missing, lost somewhere before the funeral or after it. He could never remember. The remaining rook stood in the corner of the board, squared and silent, guarding a kingdom no one was playing for anymore. Mason looked from the chess piece to the puppy. Rook, he said. The puppy's ear twitched. Mason almost smiled. That's your name, then. Rook. The puppy closed his eyes, as if the matter had been settled long before Mason understood it. Later, the rain softened. The barn grew quiet. Mason sat in the old chair beside the workbench, too tired to carve, too awake to sleep. Rook breathed softly in his nest of towels and Clara's blanket. For the first time in 3 years, Mason was not alone in the room where he kept his grief. Near midnight, the puppy stirred. At first, Mason thought he was dreaming. Then Rook lifted his head. His small body stiffened. A low sound rose from his throat, too weak to be a real growl, but clear enough to cut through the barn's silence. Mason sat up. Rook struggled to his feet, favoring his bandaged leg. He limped away from the warmth, past the workbench, past the shelves of unfinished carvings, and toward the fresh pile of scrap wood Mason had stacked near the door. He stopped in front of it. His nose moved. Then the wounded little shepherd leaned forward and growled again at something hidden in the wood. Mason did not sleep much that first night, and neither did the puppy. Near midnight, when Rook limped toward the stack of scrap wood and growled at something Mason could not see, Mason crossed the barn with the flashlight held low and his shoulders tight with old instinct. The beams slid over cracked boards, muddy bark, and wet pallet slats he had unloaded before the rain turned hard. For a moment, he expected to find another wounded animal, or perhaps a snake driven in by the cold. Instead, a field mouse shot out from under a loose strip of pine and disappeared through a gap in the wall. Rook stumbled backward, startled by his own bravery, then tried to growl again. The sound came out small and uneven. Mason stared at him. Then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he laughed. It was not loud. It did not last long. But it was real enough to make the old barn feel different for one breath. "Guardian of the kingdom," Mason murmured, terrified of a mouse. Rook blinked up at him with one ear half folded and one front leg wrapped in white bandage, as if insulted by the accusation. Then he turned in an awkward circle, limped back to Clara's blanket, and collapsed as though he had defended the entire mountain from invasion. That was how their life began. Not with a miracle. Not with some great sudden healing. Just small duties, repeated until they became a rope Mason could hold on to. In the morning, Rook needed food softened with warm water. At noon, his bandage needed changing. In the evening, he needed medicine hidden inside small pieces of chicken, because he learned within 2 days how to spit out pills with theatrical disgust. At first, Mason found the routine irritating. He had built his grief around silence, and Rook had no respect for silence. He whined when hungry, knocked over a tin cup with his oversized paws, sneezed into sawdust, and once dragged one of Mason's socks into his blanket nest like a trophy stolen from an enemy camp. The puppy grew quickly. Within a few months, his ribs no longer showed. His black and tan coat filled out, dark across his back like a saddle, and golden along his legs and cheeks. His paws remained too big for him, making him clumsy when he ran across the yard. One ear finally stood tall, while the other leaned slightly outward, giving him a permanently curious look. A thin, pale scar stayed across his muzzle, where the wire or some older cruelty had marked him before Mason found him. His eyes became a deep golden brown, watchful, intelligent, and far too serious for a dog who still chased leaves as if they had personally offended him. Mason changed too, though he noticed it less. He began opening the curtains before noon because Rook liked to sit in rectangles of sunlight. He started walking the back road each afternoon because the dog needed exercise. He went into town more often for dog food, medicine, and chew toys strong enough to survive a growing German shepherd's jaws. People still stared. Some whispered. Dottie Lane, from behind the counter at Lane's Market, watched him buy a bag of puppy food one Tuesday morning and raised one penciled eyebrow. "So now you've got yourself a dog," she said. Dottie was dressed in a yellow sweater covered in stitched daisies, her gray curls sprayed into place, her mouth sharp as ever. She had the kind of personality that made sympathy sound like a warning label. Mason placed the dog food on the counter. "Looks that way." "Hope you know what you're doing." Mason looked at the bag, then at the rain streaking down the front window. That would be new. Dottie did not know whether he was joking. Mason barely knew either. Behind him, a younger man chuckled softly. His name was Caleb Turner, 28, the new UPS driver for the mountain route. Caleb was tall and broad, with sandy blonde hair, a crooked front tooth, and the restless friendliness of someone who had been raised to talk even when no one talked back. He had moved to Black Mountain after his father died, taking the delivery job to help his mother keep their small house. Unlike most people in town, Caleb looked at Mason without pity. "What's his name?" Caleb asked. "Rook." "Like the bird?" "Like the chess piece." Caleb grinned. "That's a serious name for a puppy." "He's a serious puppy." When Mason returned home, Rook was waiting at the barn door, tail sweeping the dust, whole body shaking with joy too large to fit inside his skin. Mason had been welcomed home by teams, by commanders, by men grateful to still be breathing. None of it prepared him for the devotion of a dog who believed a trip to the grocery store was a dangerous expedition, and Mason's return was worthy of celebration. The barn slowly changed around them. At first, Mason had carved only when memories drove him to it. Now he carved because Rook made the space feel less like a tomb. The dog lay beneath the workbench while Mason shaped thrown-away wood into things the town never expected to come from scraps. A chunk of ash became a resting shepherd with its head on its paws. A split piece of walnut became an eagle with one wing folded, the crack hidden inside the feathers. A crooked maple branch became the bowed figure of a soldier, kneeling with his helmet in his hands. Some pieces hurt more than others. One winter evening, Mason worked for nearly 6 hours on a block of pale cherry wood taken from the sawmill discard pile. He carved 2 hands from it, one large, one small, fingers almost touching. He did not plan it that way. The shape simply appeared as the blade followed the grain. When he finished, he set the piece on the shelf and turned his back before he could decide whether to break it. Rook walked to the shelf, sniffed the carving, then sat beneath it as if guarding something holy. By spring, the barn held dozens of pieces: dogs, birds, horses, soldiers, empty chairs, open hands, and a small row of chess pieces Mason carved from leftover oak. He carved a rook last. Not perfect, not polished, but strong and square, with a tiny scar cut across one side of the tower. When Rook saw it, he tried to eat it. "You have no respect for art," Mason told him. Rook wagged his tail. The town began noticing. Caleb Turner was the first outsider to step fully inside the barn. He arrived one afternoon with a package from Dr. Helen Morris. Special joint supplements she insisted would help Rook grow strong after his early injury. Caleb knocked on the open barn door, then stopped with one boot still outside. "Holy," he whispered. Mason looked up from the workbench. Caleb's eyes moved across the shelves. He saw the eagle, the soldier, the dog carvings, the small horse, the empty chairs, the hands. His easy smile faded into something quieter. "You made all these?" Mason wiped dust from his palm. "From scraps." Caleb stepped closer to the carving of the soldier. "My dad would have liked this one. He was Army. Never talked about it much." "Most don't." Caleb nodded. For once, he did not fill the silence. A week later, Earl Whitcomb stopped by after delivering another load of rejected wood near the mill. Earl was still narrow and weather-lined, his silver mustache damp from drizzle, his cap pulled low. He claimed he had only come to return a pry bar Mason had left behind, but his eyes kept drifting past Mason's shoulder into the barn. When he saw the carvings, he removed his cap. "Well," Earl said slowly, "I guess it wasn't just trash." Mason did not answer. He did not need to. But not everyone softened. Some neighbors still drove past slowly, staring at the growing stacks of wood beside the barn. One man joked that Mason was building a wooden army. Dottie told customers at the market that the carvings were probably part of his therapy, saying the word therapy like it was a stain on a shirt. Mason heard those things too. They mattered less now. Because every morning, Rook waited by the barn door. Every evening, he stretched across the threshold with the dignity of a sentry guarding a castle. He was not aggressive without cause, but he had a way of standing when strangers approached that made them stop before stepping inside. His ears lifted, his chest squared, his golden brown eyes measured the distance between the visitor and Mason's workbench. The barn belonged to Mason's grief, but Rook had decided it also belonged to life. Late that summer, Mason finally carved the piece he had avoided for 3 years. He used a curved slab of maple with a soft golden grain. For days, he worked without speaking. The shape emerged slowly. A backyard swing hanging from a tree branch, 2 figures sitting close together. Emily's hair was suggested by flowing lines. Clara's legs were carved too short to reach the ground. Mason did not make their faces detailed. He could not. He only carved the tilt of their heads, the closeness of them, the quiet happiness of a moment that no longer existed anywhere except in wood. When he finished, he stood in front of it until the light went blue outside the barn door. Then he turned away. Rook walked to the carving and lay down beneath it. That was enough. A few days later, just before sunset, Mason went out to stack a new batch of scraps near the fence. Rook had been in the yard moments earlier, chasing a grasshopper with military-level seriousness. Then the yard went still. "Rook?" No answer. Mason wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped outside. The evening air smelled of cut grass, damp bark, and distant smoke from someone's burn barrel. He looked toward the porch, then the shed, then the line of trees. "Rook!" A faint rustle came from beyond the fence, toward the old scrap path leading back in the direction of Kavanaugh sawmill. Mason's body tightened before his mind gave it permission. He crossed the yard fast, past the fence, past the weeds, past the shallow ditch where rainwater collected. He found Rook standing near a fresh scatter of discarded boards at the edge of the sawmill's dumping area. The dog's black and tan coat was dusted with ash. His ears were forward. His tail was stiff. Clenched between his teeth was a small piece of wood, blackened along one side as if it had been kissed by fire. "Drop it," Mason said. Rook did not move. Mason took one step closer. The dog backed away, not in fear, but refusal. His golden eyes locked on Mason's face. A low growl rose from his chest, not aimed at Mason, but at the darkening trees beyond the scrap pile. Mason looked from the burned wood to the shadows behind the fence. The sun slipped lower, and Rook held on. Rook stood at the edge of the sawmill's dumping area with the burned piece of wood clenched between his teeth, refusing to move. The last light of the day had turned the clouds above Black Mountain the color of cold iron. Behind the fence, Kavanaugh sawmill had gone quiet, except for the settling groan of stacked lumber and the occasional drip of water from the tin roof. The scrap pile lay in uneven shadows, broken pallet boards, splintered pine strips, warped oak, and blackened pieces too ugly even for firewood. Mason Reed stood a few feet away, one hand resting against the fence post, watching his dog as if Rook had suddenly learned a language Mason could not understand. "Drop it," Mason said again. Rook's ears stayed forward, his golden brown eyes locked on Mason's face. He did not bare his teeth. He did not growl at Mason. But the message in his body was clear. Not this one. Mason sighed and stepped closer. The piece of wood was small, maybe 10 or 12 inches long, narrow enough for Rook to carry without trouble. One side was burned black and flaky, as if it had been pulled from the edge of a fire. The other side was caked in mud and sawdust. A faint, oily smell clung to it, sharp beneath the usual scent of wet wood. It looked like a broken piece from an old pallet or a packing crate, the kind of scrap Mason normally tossed aside unless the grain gave him a reason not to. Rook took one step back. Mason stopped. "You planning to keep that thing forever?" Rook's tail moved once, very slowly, as though he was considering the offer. Mason rubbed his forehead. "Fine. Bring it then." Only after Mason turned toward the farmhouse did Rook follow. He carried the burned wood with the solemn pride of a soldier carrying a flag through smoke. By the time they reached the barn, ash had smeared across the dog's tan muzzle, making him look both heroic and ridiculous. Inside, the barn smelled of cedar dust, cold metal, and the faint sweetness of maple shavings. The yellow bulb above the workbench hummed softly. On the shelves, the wooden eagle watched from its perch. The carved soldier bowed his head. The two empty chairs faced the small window where evening had gone dark. Mason held out his hand. Rook dropped the piece of wood into his palm. It was heavier than Mason expected. Not heavy enough to alarm him, just solid in a way that did not match its size. He turned it over. The burned side left black dust on his fingers. The other side had a jagged edge where it had snapped from something larger. Most of it looked worthless. "You dragged me across the yard for this?" Rook sat. Mason examined the piece under the worklight. The charred area had eaten deep into one corner. Even if the center was usable, it would be a miserable shape to work with. Too short for a figure. Too damaged for a clean carving. Too ugly for anything tender. Mason tossed it into the discard pile near the back wall. "There. Mystery solved." Rook stood immediately. "No." The dog walked to the pile, shoved his nose between broken strips of pine, and rooted through the scraps with stubborn concentration. A few seconds later, he came back with the same blackened piece and placed it directly on Mason's boot. Mason looked down at the wood, then at Rook. "You're joking." Rook sat again, perfectly serious. Mason picked up the piece and tossed it a second time, farther now, into a crate of splintered offcuts he used for kindling. The wood landed with a hollow clatter. Mason turned back to the workbench and reached for a half-finished carving of a hawk's wing. Behind him came the scrape of paws, the rustle of scraps, then the steady click of Rook's nails on the barn floor. The burned wood appeared beside Mason's boot again. This time Mason laughed. It came out before he could stop it, rough and surprised, and it filled the barn in a way that made even the shadows seem to pause. Rook tilted his head, one ear upright and the other leaning outward, as if he had finally managed to train the man properly. "You are the most irritating animal God ever put under a roof," Mason said. Rook wagged his tail. Mason tried one more test. He picked up 3 other scraps: a clean strip of pine, a cracked piece of walnut, and a small block of ash with a nice straight grain. He set them on the floor beside the burned piece. Rook sniffed each one politely. Then he picked up the burned wood and pushed it into Mason's hand. Mason's smile faded, not because he was frightened yet, but because something about the dog's insistence felt too deliberate to ignore. Rook had always been watchful. He noticed strange footsteps before Mason did. He knew when a truck turned into the drive before its engine could be heard from the barn. But this was different. This was not guarding. This was choosing. "All right," Mason said quietly. "We'll look." He carried the piece to the workbench and brushed away the ash with a stiff wire brush. Black flakes scattered across the table. Beneath the burned surface, a thin line of brown appeared. Mason leaned closer. The grain was not straight, not plain. It curled beneath the damage in tight waves, dark honey and smoke brown twisting together like storm clouds seen through amber. He scraped a little more. The pattern deepened. Mason had learned over the last year that wood often hid its best self beneath its worst surface. A crack could become a feather line. A knot could become an eye. A burn scar could become shadow. But this piece was unusual. The grain seemed to move around the charred corner instead of ending there, as if the fire had only revealed what had already been waiting. Rook placed his chin on the edge of the workbench and watched. "Don't look so pleased with yourself," Mason muttered. He took his carving knife and shaved away a thin curl from the less damaged side. The wood beneath was warmer in color than he expected. Not pine, not cheap pallet wood, at least not the ordinary kind. Maybe maple, maybe cherry, though the burn and oil made it hard to tell. He brought it closer to his nose. The oily smell was still there, hidden under the soot. For a moment, Mason considered throwing it away anyway. Then his gaze drifted toward the shelf, where the carving of Emily and Clara on the swing sat beneath a folded cloth. He had covered it 2 days after finishing it. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because looking at it too long made the air leave his chest. Beside that covered carving stood the 2 empty chairs he had made months earlier. Rook followed Mason's eyes, then looked back at the burned wood. Mason shook his head. "You don't get to have ideas." The dog sneezed. Still, the idea had already arrived. Not a large piece, not something grand. A small carving. Rook lying in front of 2 empty chairs, body stretched across the threshold like a guard who had taken his post and would not abandon it. The burn could become shadow under the dog's chest. The swirling grain could become fur. The damaged corner might even make the piece feel older, as if it had survived something before being shaped. Mason took a pencil and marked the first lines. Rook's ears lifted. "Don't take credit," Mason said. "You found ugly wood, that's all." But his hand was gentler now. He clamped the piece carefully and began trimming away the worst of the burned edge. The knife moved slowly. Each shaving curled away black, then brown, then gold. The barn settled into the familiar rhythm of work. Blade against grain, breath through the nose, Rook's quiet movement, rain beginning again outside. For the first time all day, Mason forgot the town. He forgot Dottie Lane's whispers, the slow cars passing his property, the men who still thought he was building monuments to madness out of garbage. There was only the piece in his hand and the shape hidden inside it. The first outline of Rook appeared near midnight. Not detailed, not finished, but present. The low slope of the shoulders, the watchful head, the front paws stretched forward. Behind him, Mason marked 2 simple chairbacks. He did not carve Emily. He did not carve Clara. Not this time. Empty chairs were enough. Some absences did not need faces to be understood. Rook had fallen asleep beneath the bench, one paw twitching in a dream. Mason kept working. The burn scar was deeper than he first thought. He had to angle the chisel carefully to keep the wood from splitting. The grain resisted in strange places, harder near the center, almost as if some old knot lay buried there. Mason changed tools, choosing a narrower chisel with a sharper point. He pressed it into the dark line between the carved dog and the first chair. The blade went in cleanly, then stopped. A small sound clicked through the barn. Mason froze. The chisel had not struck a knot. It had not struck a stone trapped in the wood. The sound was too sharp, too cold, too familiar to a man who had spent half his life learning the difference between natural noises and man-made ones. Rook's head lifted beneath the workbench. Mason slowly pulled the chisel back and stared at the tiny mark in the grain. Outside, the rain tapped harder against the roof. Inside the burned piece of wood, something had answered him. And it was not wood. Mason Reed did not breathe for several seconds. The chisel rested in his right hand, its tip hovering over the tiny mark inside the burned piece of wood. The old barn seemed to grow larger around him. Every sound suddenly sharpened, rain ticking against the tin roof, the heater clicking near the wall, Rook's claws scraping softly beneath the workbench as the German shepherd rose to his feet. The small carving was still clamped in place. Rook's wooden body had only begun to take shape, stretched low before the faint outline of two empty chairs. But now the piece no longer felt like wood waiting to become art. It felt like a locked door. Mason leaned closer without touching the mark again. The sound had been too clean, too cold. A knot did not click like that. A hidden pebble might scrape, but it would not stop the blade with that hard little answer. Mason had learned long ago not to force unknown things open. In the field, curiosity could kill a man faster than fear. His hand moved away from the chisel. His breathing slowed. His mind, which had spent 3 years buried under grief, shifted into a familiar place. Observe, secure, document, do not assume. Rook stood beside the bench now, ears forward, golden brown eyes fixed on the burned wood. The dog did not bark. He only watched, body tense, as if he too understood that the game had changed. "All right," Mason said quietly. "No more cutting." He unclamped the piece of wood and set it on a clean cloth. Then he pulled a pair of nitrile gloves from a drawer where he kept finishing supplies. The gloves had been bought for wood stain and oil, not evidence, but they would do. He turned on the brighter desk lamp and examined the area where the chisel had struck. Beneath the carved line, partly hidden by the swirling brown and gold grain, was a dark seam. Not natural. Too straight. Too deliberate. Mason used the tip of a small awl, not to pry, but to trace the edge. A thin line of black material appeared beneath a shaving of wood. It looked like resin or hardened glue. Someone had cut into the piece before him, made a cavity, sealed it, then burned or discarded the wood afterward. The burn had not destroyed the secret. It had hidden it better. A chill through him that had nothing to do with rain. He picked up his phone and took photographs from every angle. The workbench, the piece of wood, the seam, the chisel mark. Rook standing beside it with his nose lifted, as if still catching that oily, wrong scent beneath the ash. Mason forced himself not to rush. One photograph blurred. He deleted it and took another. Details mattered. Details had saved lives. Details had also explained deaths when nothing else could. Only after documenting the outside did he carefully loosen one corner of the black seal. The material resisted, then lifted slightly. Underneath was not hollow rot or insect damage. It was a tiny hand-cut compartment. Inside the compartment sat something wrapped in cloudy plastic. Mason stared at it. The object was small, no larger than the end of his thumb, sealed in a strip of waterproof wrapping. Beside it, folded tight against the inside wall of the cavity, was a torn piece of shipping label. The ink had faded, but not enough. Under the lamp, Mason could make out part of a barcode, a lot number, and 3 words printed in block letters. Halden Systems Recovery. Below that, half buried under a smear of black adhesive, was a symbol Mason recognized from his years around military contractors. Not an official military seal, but the kind of logistics mark private defense companies used when moving equipment, salvage parts, or decommissioned materials through approved channels. Mason did not remove the device. He did not plug it into anything. He did not even touch it directly. Instead, he took more photographs, then folded the cloth around the wood and placed the entire piece inside an old metal ammunition box he kept beneath the bench. The box had once held cleaning tools and spare hardware. Now it held the strangest thing Rook had ever dragged home. Rook followed every movement. When Mason closed the lid, the dog stepped closer and placed one paw against the metal box. "I know," Mason murmured. "You found it." Rook looked up at him. Mason almost told him he wished he had not. The first person he called was not the police. That would come soon. But before he handed a strange data device and a defense contractor label to anyone in town, Mason needed to understand what kind of trouble had landed in his barn. He scrolled through his contacts until he reached a name he had not touched in almost 2 years. Owen Briggs. Owen was 44, built like a man who had once been impossible to move and had only softened slightly with age. He had a square face, close-cropped dark blonde hair, and a scar through one eyebrow from a roadside blast in Afghanistan. In uniform, he had been calm to the point of irritation. Out of uniform, he was still that way. He had served in a military investigative unit after leaving active combat work, the kind of place where paperwork, chain of custody, and patient suspicion mattered more than speed. Owen had known Mason before Emily died. More importantly, he had known Mason after, when most men ran out of words and quietly disappeared. The phone rang 5 times. "Mason?" Owen's voice came through rough with surprise. "Yeah." A pause. "Tell me you're not calling from a hospital." "Not this time." That's comforting in a narrow way. Mason looked toward the ammunition box. "I need to ask you something strange. With you, that covers ground." Mason sent the photographs while Owen stayed on the line. For nearly a minute, neither man spoke. Mason heard papers shifting on Owen's end, then the creak of a chair. When Owen finally answered, the humor had left his voice. "Do not open that device." "I didn't." "Do not put it near your computer. Do not let anyone else handle it. Do not post pictures. Do not ask around town. And do not tell curious neighbors." "I know." "No, Mason, I mean it. That label is from a real contractor. Halden Systems Recovery did defense salvage work, equipment disposal, transport, inventory recovery. They had some messy audits a few years back. I don't know details, but that is not something I'd treat like a souvenir." Mason's jaw tightened. It was inside a burned scrap of wood. "That makes me like it less. It came from the sawmill dump. Then you need local law enforcement involved, and I can make a call to someone who still owes me a favor. But until then, lock it up. Photograph where you found it. Write down the time. And Mason?" "What?" "If anyone comes asking about scrap wood, burned pallets, old crates, anything like that, you call me first and the sheriff second." Mason looked toward the barn door. Rain slid in silver threads beyond the window. Why would anyone come asking? Owen did not answer quickly enough. "That's what worries me." After the call ended, Mason stood in the barn with the phone still in his hand. The ammunition box sat beneath the bench, suddenly heavier than it had any right to be. Rook stood between Mason and the barn door, his body angled toward the dark outside. Mason had seen dogs alert before. This was not nervousness. It was focus. The evening passed uneasily. Mason wrote down everything he could remember. The time Rook disappeared, the exact area near the sawmill dumping edge, the oily smell, the burn pattern, the first click of metal. He printed the photographs on an old office printer that groaned with each page. He put the notes and images in a folder, then placed that folder on the kitchen table beside a mug of coffee he never drank. By 7:30, the rain had stopped. By 8, fog had filled the low ground around the farmhouse. At 8:17, headlights appeared at the end of Mason's driveway. Rook lifted his head before the engine reached the gate. A black SUV rolled slowly up the gravel drive, tires crunching over wet stone. It was too clean for the road and too expensive for anyone who normally came to Mason's place. The headlights swept across the barn wall, across the old fence, across the stacks of scrap wood near the side yard. Mason stepped onto the porch before the driver could knock. The man who climbed out was in his late 40s, tall and narrow, with a charcoal overcoat, polished shoes, and neatly combed black hair touched with gray at the sides. His face was handsome in a sharp, practiced way, but his smile had no warmth in it. He carried a leather folder under one arm and moved like a man used to being allowed past locked doors. "Mr. Reed?" he called. Mason did not step down from the porch. "Who's asking?" "Dale Mercer." The man lifted one hand in a friendly gesture that did not reach his eyes. "I represent a regional salvage buyer. We heard you collect discarded wood from Kavanaugh Sawmill." Rook moved onto the porch beside Mason. Dale's eyes flicked to the dog, then quickly away. "That a problem?" Mason asked. "Not at all. Actually, it may be an opportunity." Dale smiled again. "My client is interested in purchasing your entire scrap inventory. Everything behind the barn. Broken pallets, burned pieces, crate wood, odd cuts, all of it." Mason looked past him to the SUV. "What client?" "A private buyer." "Private buyers don't usually care about trash." Dale gave a soft laugh. "You'd be surprised what reclaimed wood is worth these days. Rustic design is very popular." "How much?" Dale opened the folder and removed a check already made out to Mason Reed. The amount was $5,000. For a pile of broken boards the town had mocked him for collecting. Mason did not take the check. Rook stepped forward. His hackles rose along his black and tan back. A low growl rolled out of him, deeper than Mason had ever heard it. Dale Mercer's smile thinned. Mason looked at the check, then at the man holding it. The whole town had called the wood worthless, but someone had just driven through fog after dark to buy every scrap of it. Mason did not take the check. Dale Mercer stood at the bottom of the porch steps with $5,000 pinched between two fingers, smiling as if the amount should have softened any man's suspicion. The black SUV idled behind him, its headlights washing over the wet gravel, the fence line, and the uneven stacks of scrap wood near the barn. Fog curled low across the yard, and in that pale glow, Dale looked almost polished enough to belong somewhere else entirely. A hotel lobby, a courthouse hallway, a boardroom where men destroyed lives without ever raising their voices. "No," Mason said. Dale's smile held for half a second too long. "Mr. Reed, I'm not sure you understand. This is a generous offer for material that, respectfully, has no real market value. Then you won't miss it." Rook stood beside Mason on the porch, his black and tan body rigid, scarred muzzle pointed at Dale. The German Shepherd did not bark. He did not need to. A low growl stayed inside his chest, quiet and steady, like thunder still trapped behind the mountain. Dale's eyes moved to the dog again. This time, irritation slipped through his friendly mask. "Beautiful animal," he said. "Protective. He has good judgment." Dale folded the check slowly and tucked it back into his leather folder. "Offers like this don't come every day. Neither do men who drive out after dark to buy trash." For the first time, Dale did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted past Mason, toward the barn. It lingered there just long enough to tell Mason everything he needed to know. That was not the look of a salvage buyer admiring reclaimed wood. It was the look of a man trying to measure distance, doors, windows, locks, and risk. Then Dale smiled again. "If you change your mind, I'll be in touch." "I won't." Dale gave a small nod, walked back to the SUV, and opened the driver's door. Before getting in, he glanced once more at the barn. The look was quick this time, but sharper. Rook stepped down one porch stair. Dale got into the SUV and drove away. Mason watched the taillights fade through the fog. Only when they vanished beyond the bend in the road did Rook stop growling. "You didn't like him either," Mason murmured. The dog looked toward the barn and then back at Mason. Neither of them slept much. By morning, the rain had cleared, leaving Black Mountain washed in pale light. Mist clung to the low fields, and the ridges beyond town rose blue and quiet against the sky. Mason was in the barn before sunrise, moving the ammunition box to a locked cabinet bolted beneath the workbench. He did not like hiding from trouble, but he liked stupidity less. At 9:15, a sheriff's cruiser turned into the driveway, followed by an older gray pickup with Tennessee plates. Sheriff Tom Whitaker stepped out first. Tom was 52, thick through the middle, with a square face, close-cropped brown hair going gray, and a mustache that made him look sterner than he usually was. He had been sheriff in Buncombe County long enough to know every kind of liar, drunk, grieving parent, petty thief, and good person who made one bad decision. He believed in procedure, distrusted drama, and preferred facts he could hold in his hand. Mason had known him for years, though mostly through nods at gas stations and funerals. Tom adjusted his belt and looked toward the barn. "Morning, Mason." "Sheriff?" Tom's eyes moved over the scrap piles, the old pickup, the barn door, then Rook standing like a sentry beside Mason's leg. "Owen said you had something unusual." The man from the gray pickup came around the cruiser. Owen Briggs looked older than Mason remembered, but not weaker. At 44, he was still broad-shouldered and deliberate, with close-cropped dark blonde hair, a scar cutting through one eyebrow, and eyes that missed very little. He wore jeans, a dark jacket, and the expression of a man who had already decided this visit was serious before anyone else caught up. "Mason," Owen said. "Owen." They did not hug. Men like them rarely did when worry stood between them. But Owen gripped Mason's shoulder once, firm and brief, and that was enough. Inside the barn, Tom slowed. His skepticism did not disappear, but it shifted. The shelves of carvings drew his attention before the evidence did. He looked at the eagle, the soldier kneeling with his helmet in his hands, the two empty chairs, the wooden dog with unfinished paws. For a moment, his face softened. "You made these?" "Most nights." Tom glanced at Mason, and something like regret passed through his eyes. He had probably heard the jokes, too. Maybe he had even believed some of them. Owen moved straight to the workbench. "Show us." Mason unlocked the cabinet and removed the ammunition box. He laid out the photographs first, then the written notes, then the burned piece of wood still wrapped in cloth. He did not touch the small device inside the compartment. Owen approved with a quiet nod. Tom leaned in, frowning. "This came out of that little scrap?" "Rook found it." Tom looked at the dog. Rook looked back without blinking. "Well," Tom said, "that's not the strangest witness I've dealt with." Owen examined the shipping label through a magnifying glass he had brought in his pocket. Then he used a small evidence bag and tweezers to secure the device without handling it directly. He did not speak much while he worked. His silence made the barn feel colder. Finally, he said, "Halden Systems Recovery." Tom folded his arms. "Name mean something?" "It should." Owen placed the label under the light. "Private contractor, defense salvage, inventory disposal, recovery transport. They handled decommissioned equipment for several federal and military facilities. A few years back, there were questions about missing parts after a warehouse fire. Questions from who? People above my old pay grade. Tom looked at Mason. And this ends up in your scrap pile? Mason told them about Rook disappearing, the burned wood, the oil smell, the hidden compartment, Dale Mercer, the black SUV, and the $5,000 offer. Tom listened with the face of a man trying not to show that each detail was pulling him away from doubt. When Mason described Dale's stare toward the barn, Owen stopped writing. What name did he give? Dale Mercer. Owen's jaw tightened. Tom noticed. You know him? I know the name. Mercer worked private logistics for Halden. Not high profile. The kind of man who moves things and makes sure paperwork says they moved somewhere else. Tom exhaled through his nose. That's not comforting. Owen connected the device to a secure reader he had brought, not Mason's computer. It was a small black case with its own screen and no outside network connection. Even then, he worked carefully, copying only basic file information. The screen filled with coded file names, dates, shipment numbers, and scanned inventory forms. Owen did not open everything. He did not need to. After 10 minutes, his face had gone hard. What? Mason asked. Owen turned the screen slightly so Tom could see. These are disposal logs, or supposed to be. Some equipment marked destroyed after a warehouse fire was listed again in later transport records under different lot numbers. Tom squinted. Meaning? Meaning somebody may have claimed military surplus equipment was destroyed, then moved parts through private channels. If the wrong components were involved, that is federal. Mason looked down at the burned wood. Trash, the town had said. No real value, Dale had said. Rook pressed against Mason's leg. Tom removed his hat and rubbed the back of his head. I'll contact the State Bureau and Federal Liaison. Until then, this stays quiet. Mason, you don't talk to anyone. If Mercer comes back, you call me. He will come back, Owen said. Tom looked at him. Owen's voice was calm, but there was no comfort in it. Men don't offer $5,000 for scrap unless they already know what they lost. That afternoon, Tom had one of his deputies drive by the property twice. Mason did not recognize the deputy well, a young woman named Rachel Knox, 26, with a compact build, dark hair pulled into a tight bun, and the alert energy of someone still trying to prove she deserved the badge. She nodded to Mason from the cruiser, but did not stop. Tom wanted the place watched without making a spectacle of it. Mason spent the rest of the day installing the 2 small security cameras he had bought months earlier and never used. One above the porch, one facing the barn. Caleb Turner helped him mount the second when he stopped by with a delivery. Caleb was cheerful as always, but his smile faded when he saw Mason checking sight lines instead of talking about wood. Everything okay? Caleb asked. No. Caleb looked toward Rook, who had not left the barn doorway all afternoon. Anything I can do? Forget you saw the cameras. Caleb nodded, the humor leaving his face. Done. By dusk, the yard felt different, not empty. Watched. Mason saw no one at first. Only trees, fence, scrap piles, the soft orange light in the barn window. But Rook knew. The dog stayed at the barn threshold, body facing the woods, ears forward, tail still. Once, around 8, he growled at the darkness beyond the fence. Mason turned off the barn light and stood beside him. The forest did not move. At 10:37, the porch camera caught headlights slowing on the road, then passing without turning in. At 11:12, the barn camera recorded a shape near the fence line. Mason was inside the barn, sharpening a carving knife he did not plan to use. Rook stood so quickly, the chair scraped behind him. On the small monitor, a man in dark clothing climbed over the back fence. He landed in the wet grass, paused, and looked straight toward the barn. Then he began walking toward the door. Mason watched the man on the security monitor cross the wet grass toward the barn. For half a second, the old part of him wanted to move fast. Too fast. It wanted the door open, the threat on the ground, the whole thing finished before the intruder understood he had stepped onto the wrong property. That part of Mason had been trained in places where hesitation could bury good men. But this was not a battlefield. This was his home. This was evidence. This was Rook standing beside him, with his black and tan body rigid, ready to protect a barn full of carved grief. Mason reached for the light switch and turned the barn dark. The yellow bulb above the workbench died. The shelves disappeared into shadow. The only light left came from the small monitor near the workbench and the thin moonlit line beneath the barn door. Rook gave one hard bark, deep enough to shake dust from the rafters. "Stay," Mason whispered. Rook did not stay. He moved to the side door, not recklessly, not blindly, but with the low, controlled posture of a shepherd who understood that something wrong was trying to enter. His ears stood forward. The scar across his muzzle caught a faint strip of gray light. Mason pulled his phone from his pocket and called Sheriff Tom Whitaker. Tom answered on the second ring. His voice was thick with sleep, but sharp underneath. "Whitaker." "He's here," Mason said. "Back fence, moving toward the barn. Camera has him." "Are you inside?" "Yes." "Stay there. Don't engage unless you have to. Deputies are on the way. I'm coming." Mason ended the call and set the phone to record audio. Then he picked up nothing more dramatic than a heavy flashlight from the workbench. He had weapons locked in the house. He did not go for them. The intruder was outside. The evidence was secured. The cameras were running. The best move was not always the loudest one. A soft scrape came from the side of the barn, metal against wood. The intruder was working the old side latch. Mason moved behind a stack of oak planks, keeping himself between the side door and the locked cabinet beneath the bench. He could see the monitor from there. The man outside wore a dark jacket, dark gloves, and a knit cap pulled low. He was medium height, compact, and careful with his movements, but not calm. Every few seconds he looked over his shoulder toward the road. He was afraid of being seen. That told Mason something. A professional would have moved cleaner. A desperate man moved like this. The latch clicked. Rook exploded forward. The side door opened 6 inches, and the German shepherd hit the gap with a bark so violent the intruder stumbled backward. Rook did not rush into the yard. He did not chase. He planted himself inside the doorway, broad chest low, teeth showing, growl rolling from somewhere ancient and absolute. His body blocked the opening like a living wall. "Get back," the man hissed. Rook answered with another bark. The intruder swung one boot toward the door, trying to scare him off. Rook snapped at the air, close enough to make the man jerk away, but not close enough to bite. Mason saw it and felt a fierce, strange pride. Rook was not out of control. He was holding the line. "Mason Reed," the man called into the darkness. "I just need what isn't yours." Mason did not answer. The man pushed the door again. Rook lunged forward just enough to force him back. A small object slipped from the intruder's jacket pocket and hit the floor near the threshold. He cursed, bent for it, and Rook barked so hard the man flinched and lost his balance. Something else dropped into the mud outside with a metallic sound. Then headlights swept through the trees. The intruder froze. A siren chirped once from the driveway. Sheriff's office, Tom Whitaker shouted from outside. Hands where I can see them. The man turned to run toward the fence, but a second cruiser came down the back access road, lights flashing red and blue through the fog. Deputy Rachel Knox stepped out with her sidearm low and steady. She was young, but there was nothing uncertain in her stance now. Rain shone on her dark hair and shoulders as she blocked the path. Don't, she said. The man stopped. Tom reached him first and forced him to his knees. Owen Briggs arrived moments later in his gray pickup, boots hitting the mud before the engine had fully settled. He was not law enforcement tonight, not officially, but one look at his face showed that he understood exactly what had almost happened. Mason opened the barn door only after Tom called his name. Rook stayed in front of him. The intruder was identified as Kyle Voss, 36, a logistics subcontractor with a narrow face, pale skin, and anxious eyes that never stayed in one place. He had the soft hands of a man who worked more with shipping records than tools, but there was mud on his knees and panic in his breathing. Tom found no weapon on him, only a small pry tool, black gloves, and a folded map showing the back side of Mason's property. Near the side door, Deputy Knox recovered the object that had fallen from Kyle's pocket. A phone. In the mud outside, Owen found the metallic sound Mason had heard. A key fob. It bore the logo of Halden Systems Recovery. Owen held it up under the flashlight. His expression did not change, but Mason saw the anger in his eyes. That's enough to pull the thread, Owen said. It did more than that. By morning, Tom had secured a warrant for the black SUV seen on Mason's camera the night before. The license plate matched the vehicle Dale Mercer had driven. The key fob from Kyle Voss opened it. Inside, investigators found shipping manifests, burner phones, cash envelopes, and printed lists of scrap pickups from 3 different mills across 2 counties. Kavanaugh Sawmill was only one of them. Within 48 hours, state investigators and federal agents were involved. The lead federal agent was Angela Pierce, 41, a tall black woman with close-cropped natural hair, clear brown eyes, and a voice that never rose because it never needed to. She had spent years investigating procurement fraud and defense contractor theft, and she carried herself with the patient confidence of someone who knew paper trails could bleed as badly as crime scenes. She treated Mason neither like a hero nor like a broken man. She treated him like a witness, and somehow that felt like respect. Agent Pierce explained only what she could. Halden Systems Recovery had been contracted to dispose of outdated equipment from a defense storage facility after a warehouse fire 2 years earlier. Certain components had been marked destroyed. They had not been destroyed. Some were stripped, resold through private channels, and hidden under false lot numbers. When an internal employee gathered evidence, someone inside the operation hid copies of the records inside small pieces of burned pallet wood, scheduled to be dumped as industrial waste. The plan, Agent Pierce said, might have been to retrieve the pieces later before anyone noticed. But one piece had traveled to Kavanaugh Sawmill's scrap pile. One piece had been ignored by every man who saw only trash. One piece had been carried home by Rook. The device inside the wood contained enough shipment records, payment logs, and names to connect Kyle Voss, Dale Mercer, and 2 Halden managers to the scheme. Kyle tried to bargain first. Dale denied everything until investigators matched his SUV, his payment records, and his late-night visit to Mason's house. By the end of the week, arrests were made quietly but firmly. The town heard about it in fragments. A contractor scandal, federal agents at Kavanaugh, a man arrested near Mason Reed's barn. The same people who had laughed at Mason now drove past his property more slowly than before. Dottie Lane stopped repeating jokes in the grocery store. Earl Whitcomb stood outside the sawmill for a long time one morning, staring at the scrap pile as if it had become a church altar. Mason did not celebrate. When Agent Pierce returned the burned wood after the evidence photographs and lab work were complete, it was sealed in a clear, protective bag. The carving was unfinished, interrupted forever by the discovery inside it. Rook sniffed the bag, then looked at Mason as if asking whether the strange little war was over. "I think so," Mason said. But the barn did not feel the same. For 3 years, it had been a place where Mason hid from the world. Then Rook had made it a place to breathe. Now strangers knew about it. Deputies, agents, investigators. The secret had been pulled into daylight, and Mason felt the old instinct to close every door again. The morning after the arrests became public, Mason opened the barn before sunrise. Fog lay low over the field. Rook settled at the threshold, tired but proud, his head resting on his paws. Mason stood over the unfinished carving of Rook and the 2 empty chairs. The chisel mark was still there, the place where wood had answered with metal. A car slowed at the gate. Not a black SUV this time. A dusty white news van with a local station logo on the side. A woman stepped out carrying a camera bag. She was in her mid-30s, slender, with shoulder-length auburn hair tucked behind one ear, green eyes bright with focus, and a beige raincoat belted at the waist. She moved carefully, not like Dale Mercer measuring weaknesses, but like someone approaching a wounded animal she did not want to frighten. Her name, printed on the press badge around her neck, was Claire Bennett. She stopped outside the fence instead of opening it. "Mr. Reed?" she called gently. Mason said nothing. Claire lifted one hand, not quite a wave. "I'm sorry to come this early. Sheriff Whitaker gave me your name, but not your story. He said I should ask permission first." Rook raised his head. Claire looked from the dog to the barn, then back to Mason. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice softer now. "America needs to hear what happened here." Mason's hand tightened around the barn door. Behind him, the shelves held every piece of grief he had carved in secret. And for the first time, the world was waiting outside. Claire Bennett waited outside Mason Reed's gate until he gave her permission to enter. That was the first thing Mason noticed about her. Not the camera bag hanging from her shoulder. Not the press badge resting against her beige raincoat. Not even the careful green eyes that seemed to study the world without trying to own it. It was the way she waited. Most people had spent years pushing into Mason's grief with opinions, pity, gossip, or fear. Claire simply stood beyond the fence, one hand resting lightly on the gate latch, as if she understood that some places were not opened by metal keys. She was 34 years old, a reporter for a local television station in Asheville, slender and slightly taller than average, with auburn hair that curled around her jaw whenever the mountain air turned damp. Her face was gentle, but not weak. Years of interviewing families after fires, floods, accidents, and court verdicts had taught her when to speak, and when silence carried more truth than a question. She had started her career chasing fast stories. Somewhere along the way, after watching too many people cry under bright camera lights, she had learned that the best stories did not need to be hunted. They needed to be honored. Mason opened the gate. Rook stood at his side, black and tan coat shining in the pale morning light, one ear straight, the other slightly angled outward, golden brown eyes fixed on Claire. The scar across his muzzle had faded to a silver line. He did not growl, but he did not welcome her either. Claire looked at the dog first. "You must be Rook." Rook blinked once. Mason said, "That's about as warm as he gets with strangers." "I respect a good security team," Claire replied. That almost made Mason smile. He led her across the yard toward the barn. The old building looked tired in the daylight. Red paint peeling, roof patched in 3 different places, one wall leaning as though it had been listening to the mountains too long. Claire did not comment on any of that. She waited while Mason slid the door open. Then she stepped inside and forgot the question she had come to ask. The barn was filled with wood. Not piles of junk, not forgotten scraps, not the sad remains of a man who had lost his mind after losing his family. The shelves were lined with carvings that seemed to breathe in the soft light. German shepherds lying watchfully at invisible doors, eagles caught just before flight, horses with wild manes, soldiers kneeling with helmets in their hands, 2 wooden hands reaching across a crack in the grain, small birds, chess pieces, empty chairs, and a carved pup wrapped beside the suggestion of a child's blanket. Claire moved slowly, as if afraid a loud step might break something sacred. "You made all of these from the scrap pile?" she asked. Mason looked at the shelves. "From what was left." Claire turned to him then. She understood. Not completely. Perhaps no one could. But enough. The interview did not begin with the crime. Claire asked first about the wood, then about the barn, then about Rook. Only after Mason told her how he had found the puppy under broken pallets in the rain did she ask about the burned piece of wood and the evidence hidden inside it. She kept the camera steady, but her voice softened when Mason spoke Clara's name. When she asked about Emily and Clara, Mason almost stopped. Rook leaned against his leg. So Mason answered, not with everything, but with enough. Emily had been a teacher. Clara had loved chess. The rook had been her favorite piece because it guarded the corners. That was why the dog had his name. Claire lowered the camera after that. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For trusting me with their names." The story Claire produced was supposed to be a short, local segment about a federal contractor scandal, broken open by an unlikely piece of evidence. But as she edited this footage, she realized the real story was not the crime. The crime was only the door. What waited behind it was a man who had been mocked for collecting what others threw away, a dog who had been abandoned in the same kind of pile, and a barn where grief had slowly become something useful, beautiful, and alive. She interviewed Sheriff Tom Whitaker outside the courthouse. Tom stood stiffly in his uniform, uncomfortable in front of cameras, but honest. He admitted he had first approached Mason's story with doubt because the town had already decided what Mason was. Then he looked straight into the lens and said, "Sometimes the person everyone dismisses is the only one still paying attention." She interviewed Dr. Helen Morris at her clinic. Helen, tall and silver-haired, with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, described the night Mason carried in a freezing German Shepherd puppy wrapped in a child's blanket. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes did not. She interviewed Caleb Turner beside his brown delivery truck. Caleb, broad-shouldered and sandy-haired, grinned nervously at first, then grew serious when he described stepping into Mason's barn for the first time. "It didn't feel like a workshop," he said. "It felt like somebody had taken pain and taught it how to stand." Even Earl Whitcomb agreed to speak. The old sawmill driver stood with his grease-stained cap in both hands and admitted he had once told Mason the scraps were not worth burning. "I was wrong about the wood," Earl said. "And I was wrong about the man." Dottie Lane resisted longer. Pride had deep roots in her. But 2 days before the segment aired, she called Claire and asked if it was too late. At Lane's Market, wearing a blue floral sweater and too much powder on her cheeks, Dottie looked into the camera and said, "I thought I was worried about him. Maybe I was just uncomfortable with grief that didn't heal the way I wanted it to." Claire used that line. The segment aired on a Sunday evening. By Monday morning, The station website had crashed. By Tuesday, national outlets were calling. By the end of the week, people across America knew the story of Mason Reed, Rook, and the burned piece of wood. But what spread farthest was not the scandal. It was one quiet sentence Mason said when Claire asked why he still carved from scraps. Because being thrown away doesn't mean something is finished. Orders began arriving before Mason knew what to do with them. Families of soldiers asked for kneeling figures carved from old fence boards. Widows asked for 2 empty chairs. Dog owners sent photographs of German shepherds, Labradors, mutts with gray muzzles and tired eyes. Parents who had lost children asked for birds, small horses, and open hands reaching across cracks in the grain. They did not want perfect wood. They wanted wood that had survived something. Mason almost refused all of it. Then Claire showed him a letter from a woman in Ohio whose husband had died by suicide after leaving the army. She wanted a small wooden rook because, she wrote, "I need something that reminds me someone is still guarding the corner." Mason took the order, then another, then another. Caleb helped build a simple website. Earl helped repair the barn roof. Sheriff Tom recommended better locks. Dr. Helen introduced Mason to June Patterson, the founder of Safe Harbor Shepherd Rescue. June was 51, broad-shouldered, sunburned, and blunt as a hammer, with cropped gray blonde hair and hands rough from 20 years of saving dogs people had failed. She did not gush over Mason's fame. She looked at Rook, looked at the barn, and said, "If this place is going to help dogs, then let's make sure it helps the right way." Mason liked her immediately. He promised a portion of every sale to the rescue. Later, he opened free Saturday carving classes for children who had lost parents to illness, accidents, or war. He did not lecture them about healing. He taught them how to hold a blade safely, how to follow the grain, how to use a crack instead of hiding it. Some children spoke, some did not. Mason understood both. The barn became Rookwood Studio. The sign was carved from reclaimed oak. Mason shaped the letters himself. Caleb held the ladder while Earl complained that Caleb was holding it wrong. June arrived with 3 rescue shepherds who tried to steal a box of donuts. Dr. Helen brought coffee. Sheriff Tom pretended he had only stopped by for security reasons. Dottie came with peach cobbler and stood awkwardly near the door until Mason accepted it. Claire kept returning. At first, it was for follow-up pieces, then to help answer letters, then to bring lunch when Mason forgot to eat. She never tried to replace Emily. She never touched Clara's things without asking. She never told Mason it was time to move on, as if love were a room one simply left behind. She entered gently, with patience, humor, and a tenderness that did not demand a name before Mason was ready to give it one. Rook accepted her before Mason did. The dog began bringing Claire small scraps from the bin and dropping them at her feet. Claire called them gifts. Mason called them warnings. But when Rook rested his head on her boot one evening, while Mason sanded a small wooden chess piece, the barn felt quieter in a way that no longer hurt. On the day the studio officially opened, Mason placed the first burned piece of wood inside a glass case near the entrance. The carving remained unfinished, the mark where the chisel struck metal still visible. Beside it, he placed Clara's missing Rook chess piece, found months later beneath the old cedar chest. Below the case, Mason mounted a small wooden plaque. "Even what is thrown away can still guard a miracle." Visitors read it in silence. Rook lay in the doorway like a king pretending to be a guard dog. Claire stood beside Mason, her shoulder close to his, not replacing anyone, not erasing anything, simply present. Outside, Black Mountain rose blue and patient beneath the afternoon sun. For 3 years, Mason had believed love ended where loss began. Now, watching children carry cracked pieces of wood into the studio, watching Rook lift his head as Claire laughed softly beside him, he finally understood. Love did not die when grief arrived. Sometimes, it simply learned another shape. The lesson of this story is simple. Never believe that something broken has no purpose left. A burned piece of wood became the key to truth. An abandoned dog became a guardian. A grieving man became a light for others. What the town called trash, God used to reveal a miracle. Sometimes in our daily lives, we feel like Mason. We carry pain quietly. We feel forgotten, judged, or thrown away. But God sees what people overlook. He sees the value hidden under the scars. He sees the beauty beneath the ashes. And when the time is right, He can use even the smallest broken piece to open a door we never expected. So if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part moved you the most. If you believe God can still turn broken things into blessings, comment Amen below. And if you love stories about faith, loyalty, rescue, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, comfort your heart, and remind you every day that your story is not over yet.